I would like to introduce MMAF board member and veteran Barry Winslow. Barry served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army and is a Vietnam veteran. He went on to a career in banking, serving as vice chairman of TCF Financial Corporation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Barry Winslow.
Good evening, folks. Thank you so much for being here this evening. We really appreciate it. I'm going to show a few pictures this evening of what Vietnam was like in the 60s and 70s and what America was like in the 60s and 70s. If I get them out of order, please feel free to throw something at me. So what you see on the screen in front of you right now is a bronze statue. It stands at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's titled "The Three Soldiers," and it commemorates the 2.7 million men and women who fought in Vietnam. And tonight, it's my privilege and great honor to lead a tribute honoring Vietnam veterans. And I want to relate some of the hardships they encountered on the home front. And it's tough to pin down the duration of the Vietnam War, but officially the combat portion of the Vietnam War lasted from early 1963 until March of 1973, when the last U.S. combat troops left. However, as most of you I think in this room know, particularly the military folks, the military advisors were in Vietnam as early as 1958, and many stayed there until the fall of Saigon in 1975. As I said, over that time, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. Believe it or not, approximately 70% of those were volunteers, not draftees. More than 58,300 of them were killed in Vietnam. 60% of those killed were under the age of 21 years old. 250,000 were wounded badly enough to earn a Purple Heart, and of those 250,000, 75,000 were disabled, 25,000 seriously disabled. In 2005, when the Minnesotans Military Appreciation Fund was in its formative stages, Gene Sid and the founding fathers of MMAF, many of whom are here tonight, had two major inspirations. Their first inspiration was to show appreciation and respect, in particular to the post-9/11 Minnesota military personnel for their sacrifices, commitment, and professionalism that they'd exhibited. But the second goal that Gene and the founding fathers had was to set an example for the state and country as to how soldiers should be honored, appreciated, and supported in spite of whatever one's political beliefs might be. Gene loved America. He was eternally grateful for the opportunities that America had offered him, and he thought all Americans should be equally as grateful. The tragic treatment of returning Vietnam veterans was still vivid in Gene's mind, and he considered it to be a national disgrace that needed to be remedied. He and the other MMAF founders thought that by encouraging and demonstrating honorable treatment and respect for Middle East vets, that they were also helping to right a wrong and repay a debt that was owed to Vietnam veterans. These are some frequent and familiar scenes that I think many of you, particularly some of the older folks in the audience, saw in the 60s. This is a typical Vietnam scene, as is this, unfortunately. This is a fire support base that isn't in Laos, but it's close enough to see Laos and North Vietnam from there. So these are frequent scenes that Americans would see in the newspaper and on TV nightly. While events like this were taking place in Vietnam, these were the almost everyday images that were seen somewhere in the United States. Not only was America going through a profound demographic and cultural change in the mid-60s, but people just simply couldn't understand the reasons for our presence in Vietnam and the escalation of the war. The White House frequently referred to the vague strategic notion of stopping the spread of communism, but unlike today, there really wasn't any 9/11 type events. There were no Osama bin Laden type characters who presented a threat to Americans and American soil. And in fact, much of the public back in those days believed that President Johnson's administration had fabricated Vietnam events, much like the Gulf of Tonkin naval action. And to make matters worse, for the first time ever, scenes like this were seen every day. And casualty scenes like this came into the homes of Americans virtually every night through their evening news. As the anger and the confusion regarding the war grew, the military increasingly became a symbol and the physical embodiment of the U.S. government in the war. The most convenient way for people to protest one-on-one was to yell at soldiers or worse. Sadly, it became very trendy to bash soldiers. Most of the country simply couldn't separate the warrior from the war. You recognize this guy? This is me in 1971. I'm sure Roger's going to give me grief about these sideburns later tonight. I was a first lieutenant in Army Intelligence, and I was commissioned through ROTC at Ohio State University. This particular picture was taken a couple of weeks before I left Vietnam in the late summer of 1971. Like most Army Vietnam returnees, my group landed at Travis Air Force Base, which is north of San Francisco, and we were taken by bus to Oakland Army Base. This is the entrance to Oakland Army Base you see here. Oakland Army Base was the primary out-processing facility for soldiers returning home from Vietnam. And so we were on the bus after not very much sleep with the typical military 20-plus hour flight with, guys sitting everywhere. We were all asleep on the bus or in a pretty jet-lagged stupor. As we approached the front gate of Oakland Army Base, the bus slammed on its brakes, and we started to hear shouting and actually people pounding on the sides of the bus. When we looked out the windows of the bus, we pretty much saw this. Protesters were blocking the gate, and a few had broken from the crowd and were pounding on the bus, shouting, "Baby killers, murderers, fascist bastards," etc. Well, as you can imagine, we didn't really like being demeaned, but what we really didn't like is they were delaying us getting inside Oakland Army Base and getting the hell out of the Army and going home. And so you can imagine how hot the emotions in the bus started running. Well, eventually the MPs and a few local police showed up and were able to get the gate cleared. As we exited the bus, we could still hear some of the, shall I say, creative names that people were yelling at us and as we got off the bus. We walked down the hallway of our designated building, and we came upon two posters towards the end of the hall. One of them looked a lot like this. The other one said, "Welcome home, America is proud of you." The irony of this, after our belligerent reception at the gate, was pretty overwhelming, as you can suspect. Half the guys started laughing, and the rest began cursing and swearing that I was with. As we got to our respective out-processing check-in desks, similar to this, we were advised not to wear our uniforms to the Oakland or San Francisco airports on the plane home, due to the hostile environment that existed in those days at the airport. Well, as I thought about this day over the next few months, I assumed that it was just, my experience was an infrequent one. It was just my bad luck to be there that day. However, as I interacted with other Vietnam vets over the years, it became pretty apparent that this experience was pretty typical. Almost every vet I talked to had their own unique abuse story, and like me, they remembered every detail of it. And my wife Sandy has heard it about 800 times. In the late 80s, a well-known author that many of you may have read the books or read his column, Bob Greene, sought to confirm the stories he had heard about the ugly treatment of Vietnam vets. Since his column was carried in over 200 newspapers around the country, Greene decided to request stories from Vietnam vets about their experiences. In his column, he asked, "If you are a reader of this column and you're a Vietnam veteran, were you ever spit on when you returned to the United States?" Within weeks, he received more than 1,000 letters. In fact, Bob Greene received so many letters, he published them in a book titled Homecoming: When the Soldiers Returned from Vietnam, which you see on the screen in front of you here. Most are quite emotional, as you can imagine. None were edited by Green. In the interest of time, I'm only going to read one of these letters tonight, and it's a very brief excerpt. But I think it speaks volumes about those times in the late 60s. And I will apologize to the ladies in advance. The letter contains one four-letter word, which by today's standards is relatively mild. And I thought about editing it out, but I thought it really would mute the impact of it too much. So I apologize in advance. This letter was sent to Bob Green in 1989 by a fellow named Frank Frey of Glendale Heights, Illinois. And it goes as follows. During the month of May in 1968, I took the L train to Chicago's Loop. I wanted to see Chicago again, and this was my first chance after spending a year in Vietnam and a year at the Great Lakes Naval Hospital recovering from wounds I received from stepping on a mine. I was on Wabash Avenue in Chicago. I was in uniform, and I was walking with a cane. I passed a restaurant, and a waitress came out the door and said to me, "Boy, there certainly is a lot of shit in this country." I said nothing and kept walking. She followed behind me saying things I couldn't hear, and then I heard her spit. Fortunately, she missed me. Two businessmen who overheard her remarks came to my aid and told her to leave me alone. I can't tell you how hurt I was. It hurt as much as the wounds I sustained. Well, today, I believe that in the collective consciousness of Americans, particularly those over 55, there's still a great sense of remorse and guilt about Vietnam vets. Today's soldiers and vets, many of the folks in this room, are certainly due all the appreciation, honor, and respect they receive, and much, much more. But I like to think that whenever older civilians honor today's vets, they're trying in some way to repay a debt that is long overdue to those who bravely served America when called more than 45 years ago and were ignored, reviled, or belittled frequently. And hopefully there's some Vietnam vets in this room. If you are, would you stand up, please? Do we have any? Thank you for your service. I'd like to finish with a toast. I'd like to toast those 2.7 million men and women who served in Vietnam, as well as those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So grab the closest glass that you have, and the toast I would like to make is 4 words: duty, country, honor, and brotherhood. Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Barry. Let's have a round of applause for Barry. And let's turn the tables for a moment. I want the Vietnam veterans to stay seated, and I want everybody else to stand up and give them a round of applause. And Barry, that may have been the 801st time you've told that story, but I think it's important you keep telling it so that it does not happen again. And also a quick word about the sideburns. You've been around so long that they came back in style and now they're back out. So I just want, so every 20 years or so, you're very hip. So thank you again, Barry. And now I would like to welcome MMAF grant recipient Nathan Landaas to the stage. Nathan is originally from St. Peter, Minnesota, and now resides in Burnsville with his wife and young son. He was awarded the Purple Heart in 2013 for injuries sustained in Afghanistan. Please, a warm welcome for Nathan Landaas.
Good evening. How's it going? Good. Well, I have my speech written out in front of me, and I'm just going to read off of it. Recently got a Fitbit, and according to it, I'm a little nervous, so I'm going to go ahead and just read it. So, good evening. My name is Nate Landaas. I live in Burnsville, Minnesota with my wife and 2-year-old son, Pierce. I'm a disabled veteran and a Purple Heart recipient. I'd first like to take the time to thank the MMAF for hosting this event, and all of you and my wife for standing beside me, supporting me, and dealing with me. In my experience, as I'll explain, it's the support of family, friends, and the community that can really make a difference in the lives of the returning vets. When I enlisted in the military, I thought that I had my entire career and future planned out. I wanted to be a career soldier, and I was interested in becoming a warrant officer to fly helicopters. I moved from St. Peter, Minnesota, to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and attended basic training and advanced individual training, which is where I also married my wife upon graduation. Shortly after, we were off to Washington State for my first duty station at Fort Lewis. As a new soldier and a new husband, I could almost immediately feel the stress and pressure of the life that I had volunteered for. Managing both my professional and personal life was all but simple. However, I developed a deep passion and sense of fulfillment during the countless hours spent training and developing my skills as a forward observer for the Army. With my wife by my side and a new life ahead of me, I felt that everything was perfect. I had a sense of pride and confidence that was unmatched. Although at times it was unnoticed by me, I can now see the amount of sacrifice not only that I made for the military, but the sacrifices that my wife endured as well. It was easy to get caught up in the life of the military, but I don't know what I would have done or where I would be today without her, if it wasn't for the support and commitment that she had blessed me with. About a year passed in Washington, and it was becoming home. Although the majority of the time was spent away from my family, whether I was training a few miles down the road or halfway across the country, I strived to grow and prepare for our newly announced deployment to Afghanistan. When I walked into my recruiter station to sign that dotted line, I knew I was likely to deploy. However, reality didn't set until that order was given. From that moment to the final goodbye with my friends, family, and loved ones, my life seemed to fly by. Deployment day came, and now I was faced with giving my wife a hug and kiss goodbye, saying that I'll see you soon and that I'll talk to you as much as I can. Not knowing what was yet to come, I was filled with an emotion that's indescribable. With tears held back and a head held high until my loved one stepped away, I was now preparing myself for the unknown. The next thing I knew, I was on the other side of the world, faced with blistering heat and my first view of life outside of my little world. Time passed, and I became accustomed to being in firefights, engaging enemies, and always observing with a watchful eye. I experienced firsthand the effects of war, both physically and mentally. I was desensitized by my surroundings, making it hard to maintain a sense of connection to the life I left behind just a couple months ago. I would call home as much as possible, but felt the struggle to hold on to that emotion, and that was easier just to set it aside. The only thing that I was able to focus on or relate to was what was happening to me at that exact moment and nothing else. In July 2012, that was the most impactful moments of my deployment. I witnessed one of the men that I had grown close to lose his life as he stepped on an improvised explosive device, or an IED. In that moment, my life crawled to a halt. Just as it slowed, we were forced to speed it back up and carry on. We had to clean ourselves off and did not have time to reflect. The world around us didn't slow down for that moment, and falling behind was not an option. A few days later, my platoon encountered yet another one of these moments. However, this time I was the item of focus. My vehicle struck an IED and rendered me unconscious. In an attempt to evacuate me from the area, I was placed in the vehicle only to strike another IED. It was a rough day. Needless to say, that day for me was life-changing and still affects me and the ones around me today. After some time in a recovery unit in Afghanistan, I was sent home to Fort Lewis, Washington. I suffered a traumatic brain injury as well as a multitude of other injuries due to my exposure to this blast, experiencing debilitating post-concussive migraines and feeling the effects of PTSD. The Army decided to conduct a medical board on me. Over the course of the next few months, I received treatment and care. I was evaluated by neurologists and specialists who determined that the best action was to medically retire me from the Army. In March of 2014, my separation was finalized. It left me feeling lost, now just a disabled vet with nothing or really anyone to lean on. The support systems I did have were right in front of me, but ultimately it did little, as I myself was unsure what I was feeling and where I was supposed to go. Then the birth of my son gave me a new breath and brought my life a new meaning. With my wife and son by my side, we moved back to Minnesota to start our lives over yet again. I was introduced to a program through the VA that allowed me to intern with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and I'm now fully employed with them today. This allowed me to purchase my first home, our family's first home, and gave me the footing needed to support my family and son. I continue care at the VA and still deal with my disabilities daily. And after being fed and prescribed countless forms of medications and receiving care, I realize I may feel the effects of my deployment long term. Managing a life with the effects of my TBI and PTSD, I've not given up and found ways to work around these new challenges, just to continue to grow and strive in anything that may come my way. The love and support of my wife, the soft, innocent words of my son, as well as the gratitude and appreciation from anyone who is willing to take the time to express that to me, is what pushes me to overcome my obstacles. Although a simple act, a handshake, or a kind word can be the lift one needs to get through a day, knowing that I, as a disabled veteran, and more importantly, the men and women and families that did not have the pleasure of seeing their loved ones again, have the support structures and the appreciation of so many, gives purpose to that selfless sacrifice. I cannot imagine a life where that wasn't present, and I feel sorrow knowing that the great men and women serving before me may not have been so lucky to receive these acts of support. I'd like to thank all the veterans and current military members for their continued service, all that have persevered alongside those members as a spouse, a child, a mother, a father, a sibling, or a close friend, and all that express an act of selflessness in a way to better the life of someone else. You are what we're serving for, fighting for, and all a hero in my eyes. Thank you.
Don't go away. Stay right there. Up here.
Nathan, thank you. Nathan, for the combat injuries that you've incurred, you're entitled to a second grant from MMAF. So it is my pleasure this evening on behalf of MMAF to present you with a check for $2,000.